have access to a spirit, a strength that enlarges and empowers you. Even better, you don't need to wait for the next big movement. You can heal the world. It's time for governance by grace. Welcome to Gracearchy with Jim Babka. And we're back on Gracearchy with Jim Babka. I'm Bill Protzman, your moderator. A big shout out right away to the Zero Aggression Project. Zap the state. Have a nice day. We do not represent the opinions or any of that other disclaimer stuff about Zero Aggression Project, although you can probably guess that it is somewhat aligned with what you'll hear on Gracearchy. I'd like to bring on Jim this morning to talk about something that's pretty close to his heart. This is our chance to delve into the JFK, what will we call it, tranche of papers that are being added all the time. Last week, President Trump, through an executive order, announced that he was going to release even more of the documentation around not just JFK, but Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy's assassination. And we always hope, when that happens, that there's going to be more papers that we don't actually know about yet. But given the depth of research that's gone into this, there's very little that we don't actually know that's being withheld, which is a fascinating thing in itself. But Jim today is going to talk to us about his story and this exploration he's done over years now of the JFK assassination in Dallas. Morning.
Good morning. And I want to say right up front, I have been very hesitant. We've done one episode on this.
Yep.
It's episode 105. We put it out in August of 24. It was about the lone assassin idea. There is evidence that Matthew Crooks, who shot at President Trump and pierced his ear and managed to kill and seriously wound other bystanders at a rally in Pennsylvania in July, was inspired in part. He had done research on whether or not there was a lone assassin and what distance specifically the shot was taken from. Like, was it a kind of a doable thing? He seemed to be doing his homework, we know from his web history. And I basically took the position because some of the most famous people in this, started pontificating, including Gerald Posner. I took the position that he was actually inspired by lone nut theorists, or as I like to just simply call them, lone nutters. Because they have consistently ignored evidence. And what we found in that episode, which was only about whether or not there possibly was a second shooter, that's all we covered. What we found is that he cheated. Posner and his co-author cheated. They basically cut off all information post 1964. They weren't really bargaining in good faith and telling you everything that had been revealed and discovered and learned since then, even up to the time that Mr. Posner wrote his book, which is the roughly 1989, 90, 91, somewhere in that area. I don't remember exactly what year his book came out. But he had ignored a significant amount of evidence that occurred up even through the time. Let's say he stopped doing his research at the time that he published his book, which, essentially his view is that no further research is needed. That's probably a bit unfair.
Well,
his view.
It's a decent question, though, Jim. I mean, why is it so necessary in some people's minds to hang on to this lone gunman theory while the evidence doesn't support it?
Yeah. So it seems that they need to, I don't know. And one of the things that bothers me, and I would like to get into it in another episode, is what they do in reverse, which is where they basically suggest that they start to get into the psychology of people who question the official story.
Right.
And it's not even the official story. That's not even accurate either. It's the Warren Commission story.
It's the Warren Commission
back
report.
In 1964. So I have avoided talking about this. We kind of let events dictate that I got into the subject because I felt this need to over-prepare. I'm not an expert on this subject. I do know a considerable amount. I've read and watched and even visited Dallas twice, gathering information for myself. I've been to the museum, the 6th Museum twice. I've been to I've been to I'm sorry.
I think you were at the theater last year, and you went
Yeah,
to
we went
visit
to.
the
I went.
boarding
Yeah,
house.
I've all the different stuff. Yeah, I've been
All
to
the
the boarding
places.
house a couple of times. Sat down with Miss Pat, which is something I highly recommend people do if you decide to go and kind of do this tour. I've spent a lot of time on this. I've invested a lot of hours into this, and we'll get into my story maybe here. I don't know today, but what I want to say up front, what I'm really trying to drive towards with all these words is, I can't possibly know it. I'm going to get things wrong. And people are free to come comment, particularly YouTube. That's the place where we monitor the comments the closest. And if I'm wrong about something, if there's a fact that I got wrong and you point it out, I will, and I believe I'm wrong, I will respond and tell you that I've learned something new and that I was wrong. But there's a lot of people with ideas out there that aren't accurate. I know this now because I've spent so much time on this. And what is hard is that because this isn't my number one thing, because I have other responsibilities and there's so many rabbit holes on this thing, there's literally thousands of holes to go down. I'm not joking. It's very, very hard to remember, especially at my age, everybody's name, exact times, exact details or specifications of something. So over time and repeated research, you gain a sense of things that I hope is strongly enough conveyed that when I say it, you go like, okay, well, he at least did his homework on this. He's not coming from a position of ignorance. But if I get something wrong, I get something wrong. I got to give myself enough grace on that, because I just cannot possibly devote my life to this so much that I can get every detail correct.
Well,
So I'm not
having
looking
said
at,
that, I mean, you're way ahead of the average bear on this stuff.
yeah, I'm
I
not
would,
looking to aggravate or anger anybody, because I know some people have their pet theories and different concerns about this. So I'm not an idiot. Like, if you're going to come at me like that, just go away. Like, if
yeah,
you want to have a real conversation with some grace and you have real questions, as I said, YouTube is the comment section we monitor the most closely. We do check in on Rumble as well. We don't do the other podcasts. I don't even know if they have comment sections in those, but so if you're on a podcast platform and you ask there, I'm probably not going to see it, but we are notified when we're asked on YouTube, and I would be more than happy to begin engaging those in some way, shape, or form. We're going to do a few more episodes on this. It's just a matter of my time to be able to put them together with all the other demands that come about. I don't want to turn Gracearchy 100% into JFK. I don't want to do that. But I do. It's time to start talking about this, especially now that the president has signed this rather vague executive order.
right, to bring us more information. So just to bring people up to speed, if you, like me, are interested in the Kennedy assassination, what are maybe 2 or 3 books that you'd highly recommend to read before taking a deeper dive, to sort of set the level?
There's one book that I recommend above all other, and if you go and you start talking, if you were to go survey an event of people that are gathering on this question, one book is like cream that rises to the top. There is one book that rules all other books on this subject, and it's not because Jim said so. Literally, go around and survey people. Somebody did this on a podcast, and the same book. There's different people with different books they really like, and I have a couple I really like.
Yeah.
But the person the book that rises to the top is JFK and the Unspeakable.
JFK and the Unspeakable,
by
author?
James Douglas with 2 S's. And I that book is written like a novel that includes original research in it that in fact it opens up a whole nother thing about the Chicago plot. There's information in there that was at the time groundbreaking. And it is very thorough, and it's a thick book, and it's full of footnotes. So it passes as a bona fide piece of research. But I have to tell you, a lot of these researchers are really good at research and really crappy at writing. But that book is really, really well written. Like, it's a page turner. It's like you're reading a thriller.
Yeah.
It's a very good, well organized, great prose. That's the book that is the tops all. I actually do recommend people read Gerald Posner's book, because it is the definitive book in defense of the Warren Commission position. And I actually do recommend that they read Chokeholds, which I've not finished. But Chokeholds is about a handful of things where there's no further reason for debate. On a historical basis, if you're using historian criteria, there are a handful of things that are settled. They are completely settled. The evidence is overwhelming, and it's hard. It's very, very marginal or difficult to argue otherwise. And those are things called chokeholds. Okay, so chokeholds is a relatively new book. It's less than 2-3 years old. That kind of can bring you kind of right up to speed.
How about
those would be the books?
Like movies, things that are. Is there anything worth watching?
Well, I wasn't going to do this in this podcast, but okay. So let me go
as long as we're talking about it, right?
Yeah, let me go back. I think if you really want to get a good overview of everything, Oliver Stone is a master filmmaker.
Yeah, I enjoyed that movie too.
And his JFK is entertaining. It's very well done. There are things in there that are historical shortcuts. He has a certain philosophical view of the world that very much creeps into the narrative. I disagree with Oliver Stone about something significant. He believes that the most important question is why this happened. I don't believe that's the most important question. I definitely don't believe that's where you start. And his movie starts there. Like, that's really what the movie's about.
Yeah.
It's designed to tell that story. Yeah. However, you're going to get a good sense or a good arc of this story, and you're going to get it in an entertaining package. It's just very well done. I mean, there's a scene with Donald Sutherland in it where he just basically has to practically monologue. And the acting is stunning. I mean, monologues are one of the most difficult things to deliver in a movie when you're trying to tell a story. It's just, I mean, there's just so many very good moments in that movie in terms of its craft, and you will enjoy it. I have found that you can get up to speed a lot faster through podcasts. So there's one that I favor. It was part of my early development on this subject, called America's Untold Stories. These are Trump guys who are play a little bit fast and loose at times, but they sit and tell a story. And the guy telling the story used to work at National Lampoon. So there's a sense of how to tell a story, and there's some fun with the story. And you don't worry that it's 100% right 100% of the time. It gives such a good overlay of all the various characters in the story and their historical arc in this. It's a historian's type of show. Then there are 2 podcasts, which I will put down in the show notes. I do not remember the name of one of the hosts. One is called JFK, The Enduring Secret, with Jeff Crudell. He is very fair and balanced. He's trying to tell the story on both sides. And Solving JFK is the other one, with Matt Crumpton. And what is extraordinary about these 2 podcasts, and this is when you really want to get down into the weeds, what is extraordinary about these 2 podcasts is that they try so hard to be balanced. And so they give both the evidence for and against a position, and largely leave you. In fact, I would actually say that Jeff Crudell is too kind. He's a sweet soul. And so he can't help being like, hey, I kind of like this person, even though they're full of crap. They seem like they're trying to do the right thing. Well, he's not always right about this. There's a couple of people that he's kind of even kinder to than they frankly deserve. But so to give a sense, like I would not do a full JFK podcast or devote my life to it, because I believe these 2 have done it already. There's one more, and I probably should have recommended this as one of the things to do earlier as one of the starting points. Rob Reiner did a podcast on coming up to the 60th anniversary.
That's right, yeah.
On iHeart. That's where it originally started, but it's now available in other places. You can get it in iTunes and different spots. But Rob Reiner did with Soledad O'Brien. He did his own take, and he actually names names at the very end of the series. He actually tells you who he thinks was on the ground doing the shooting that day. And he had help from people who were formerly in U.S. intelligence even. So it's really interesting because this story is beginning to emerge. I don't agree with all of the decisions Rob made in the show, but man, he puts the cookies on the lowest shelf. And again, you've got a all-time great. This is the guy that made When Harry Met Sally, right?
Yeah, right.
Didn't he do The Princess Bride too? I mean, this guy's got like this incredible resume of films, and he knows how to tell a story. There is a documentary that Oliver Stone does. It's in 4 parts. You have to either rent or buy it. And we can put the link or the name of that down in the show notes as well. Okay, so after you've watched the Oliver Stone's movie, you graduate into that 4-part series, which is documentary style. And again, it's very expertly done. And I would say Rob Reiner's thing's a little bit better, but there's some really good stuff in Stone's piece too. And you don't have to come away agreeing with all these people. You should get a multi-dimensional look at things.
Yeah, it seems like we have to. There's no easy way through all of it yet.
Yes.
So you said that why doesn't really interest you. What really interests you about this whole JFK assassination thing?
Well, let me back up then just a skosh and begin and tell this story a bit in order, if I may.
Yeah, please.
We started Gracearchy in June of 22.
22,
right?
Correct.
And around that time, I'm actually going to bet maybe even a bit before that time, maybe a month or 2 before that time. I can't pin down exactly when this started to happen. But I had a friend, close friend, who had a library of books on this subject at one point and had decided that Gerald Posner had settled all of it and case closed. But he had started to look back into this story. Something had drawn him back in. And he was beginning to tell me what he was learning. And I'll be honest, I thought his cheese had slid off his cracker. I was disappointed that he was starting to go down this track. That's how badly it bothered me.
Hang on a second. I hadn't heard that one before.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. Thanks for the laugh. There's a few people like that I could name, but I won't. So from his cheese had slid off the cracker.
His cheese had slid off his cracker. And I didn't, but I still listened because he was a friend and we would talk enough and he would start to share with me what he was learning. And I found some of it interesting and he brought up names. So these names started to be dancing around a tiny bit in my head. And then in December of 22, there are 2 events. The first was that at the beginning of the month, there was a data dump. And the data dump included some information. This is JFK file stuff that was covered on a news show I watch. And the guest host that day turns out to have been very well informed on this subject. And something had jumped out. In fact, the audience had helped with a bit of crowdsourcing. Something jumped out at him. So Lee Harvey Oswald more than likely had a CIA handler. And his name was George de Mohrenschildt. And George, we found out historically, he's got an amazing story arc that includes committing suicide, closely related to this case. And George had when basically Lee Harvey Oswald defects to the Soviet Union, he comes back to the United States. He relocates to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And very quickly, George de Mohrenschildt is on the scene. And George de Mohrenschildt later said that it was a CIA agent who basically asked him, like that we found out that there was a specific CIA agent who asked him to basically befriend Lee. Well, he comes to like Lee, actually. He ended up writing a biography where he tells much of this story. And George de Mohrenschildt left in April of 1963 for Haiti for a business trip that he was going to be on for multiple months, and he was on past the date of November 1963 when the assassination occurred. But he made a trip up north before he did that, and his trip included a stop in Washington, D.C. And what was interesting in this particular data dump, what jumped out at me that sparked all of this was that there is an internal CIA memo that is asking when he's going to be in town because they want to meet with him while he's there. His most recent assignment is Lee Harvey Oswald, and he is being asked to meet. They're asking, is he going to be in town? It's not like, before we came on, Bill, we open up our phones, we use our Google Calendar, and you send me an invite. We know when we're getting together the next time. No, it's much more complicated now. We got to find the guy. We got to get on the phone. When's he going to be in town? Who knows what's happening here? Does anybody know what's happening here? And that should not have happened. And I knew enough from the things that my friend had told me that was, let's say, if you're going to call that coincidence, it's a knee wobbler.
Yeah.
Like it's the type of thing that makes you think, wait a minute, that's a little bit beyond coincidence.
You think he was trying to stay out of contact? He didn't want to be known?
No, I don't think anything about that. I just think that it's interesting that they thought it was important to meet with him as he's leaving that assignment.
Yeah.
So, and that's going to tie into something if we get into, depending on where we go here today, because there's no agenda for today, as probably everybody can start to tell by now. That ties into another story very closely related to the records that could still be revealed. But that jumped out at me. The second thing that jumped out at me in that December was that Christmas time. My son gave me a book, and it was by an author by the name of Greg Boyd. And it has nothing to do with JFK or the assassination or anything else. Greg Boyd is a theologian. And Greg, I already owned the previous book. This was kind of the companion book. I don't want to call it the sequel. It wasn't, because it was designed to go at the same topic in a different, more complicated, in-depth way. But it was about the role of spiritual forces in the world. And I'm of the belief that this is, per the temptation of Christ, that this is cosmos diabolicus, that the state and many of our biggest institutions are in some way demonically influenced to ignore humanity and personhood and elevate their own interests. And I mean literally in a way that is like avarice filled. They're literally okay with destroying humanity as they do it.
Yep.
And so I was kind of cosmically interested or metaphysically interested in what drives evil. And I decided that I was going to begin really starting to tune into the story and try to figure out who were the actors, what were their motivations, how the world works.
There we go. So motivation is key for me as well.
Yeah. So and the first thing you have to determine when you're looking at the story is what is true and what is not, because there are a lot of people who have clouded the waters. And I even think that's part of how intelligence works. I think that's one of their tactics.
Starts with the Warren Commission.
They start putting out disinformation, right? There's these things called limited hangouts. A limited hangout means that they know you're about to catch or figure out X part of the story, so they invent another cover story to confuse your understanding of the thing that you're about to, or you just did discover, right? Well, okay, you caught us, but here's how that really happened. And every time something like that happens, when someone's attempting to investigate this in a criminal investigation or historical investigation sense, it matters not which motive we're talking about here or path, this clouds the water. And defense attorneys understand this incredibly well, right? They go into court, and this is part of what they'll do because the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. So if they can cloud the waters and then create doubt, they can get their client a mistrial or a declaration of not guilty, because it's not a declaration of innocence. That evidence, that standard isn't way too high to achieve in almost every case that where the person accused is not cooperating. The only time that happens is when they actually confess actual guilt. But innocence, we can't actually establish 100% that there's no way that someone wasn't involved in something. Very, very difficult to do. The standard in court is not guilty. So I began trying to investigate this story, and as I said, Oliver Stone's series is where I started, and America's Untold Stories. I watched quite a few episodes of that, and that helped me get up the learning curve pretty rapidly. It degrades. There's a real Dunning-Kruger effect here. You think you're really starting to figure this whole thing out. You're going up and up and up. You're like, I'm okay. I know what's going on. But when you start to actually make hypotheses, you start to find out how stupid you are. You find out how little you know. And there's so many things that you need to know about a given event, a time, a place, the people involved, their motives, how they run, what the rules of the day were that are very, very different. It's hard to believe how different the 1960s were than our present time.
I know we make these assumptions, and it's just a different
staggeringly difficult, different. And so it's been a real uphill climb to try to master to master this and to come away with some real strong sense of what happened. I do have a sense of what happened. I still wouldn't be in a position now to declare all of it because it's just, there's still some rocks that got to be turned over, or things that got to be addressed in this whole thing. And what I can tell you is that every time I felt this way, it turns out that there's a rock I overturned.
One more rock.
Oh, well, that ain't going to work. I've got to recalibrate. And I'm still in that position after all this time.
Is there any chance that the remaining documents that are released, or some portion of the remaining document release, is going to answer the questions that remain and solve everything forever and for a day?
I would say that the odds of that are incredibly low, to the point of almost vanishing. And almost everybody who has done their homework on this thing agrees. Like, this is the widespread consensus. There is a hope that there's going to be something in there. And if we, depending on where we go, I can talk to you about what some of the hopes are about what I'd like to see come out of this. But there's very little chance that there is any kind of what's called the smoking gun.
Right. Yep.
In this particular case, a staggering amount of information has come out. Okay, there's two things that are simultaneously true. One, if you go out and poll the American people right now, there's a strong, sizable majority. It's in excess of 60%. And there are times when it's knocking on the door of 70, depending on when you take the poll, believes that this was a conspiracy. At the same time, most people believe that we don't have anywhere near enough evidence to say that at this juncture. They believe that the government has simply managed to throw it all away. There is one really significant area where that definitely has happened, that they've thrown it all away, shredded it, destroyed it, lost it on purpose for the most part. And so they just kind of had to throw up their hands and be like, well, we can't really know. But so very few people are aware that there actually is a significant amount of information that's come out. That's why the Chokeholds book was written. It was designed to show that there are certain things that these things are locked down. Like, if we just isolated the discussion to these handful of things, there's no further debate on these things. It's overwhelming to the point of being a chokehold. Like, you can't get out of it. So there are those things out there. And there's a number, there's scores of things in this story that smell really bad. Like, the official version has serious problems. I would maintain that if Lee Harvey Oswald had been put on trial today, so that nobody's got like, oh, gee, we just felt the pain of John Kennedy getting shot, right? And we've had time to realize that our government is a bunch of lies. Like, this is all pre-Watergate. Like, there was still a ton of trust in the state. This is really the beginning of that erosion. This event is the beginning of that erosion. And that erosion started 2 days after the assassination, when Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald while in police custody on national television. That's when the trust started to erode, right there. That's the point. And I have this actual theory about history that, we have these decades. The decades don't really start on the calendar. The decade starts with an event or whatever. So I believe the 1980s started when the day that in August when MTV flipped on. That's the beginning of the 1980s to me. Okay. The 1980, January 1, 1980, it's not the beginning of the 80s. It's historic wise, generational wise, the way we understand the time starts with that moment. Well, there's a sea change that occurs with the assassination of John Kennedy in November 1963, and it's January 1964, we have these mop-headed guys standing on Ed Sullivan singing. And very quickly, we've got the kind of this peace generation and the protests, and everybody's becoming hippies and everything. So if you look at something before the assassination and you look at something after, you see something different happening.
Yeah, it's a different world.
That's the beginning of the 1960s, and they don't end until the 1970s. It's into we can debate when that happens. So it's just a different world at a different time. So if you transport Lee Harvey Oswald into our time, and you had the trial today, there's no way you could find him guilty. There's no way you could find him guilty for assassinating the president of the United States. That case would be won right now.
So we have something else that I don't know has been brought to bear. I was curious as we're thinking about it here. Has anybody fed all of this into ChatGPT and said, okay, so ChatGPT,
So it's funny. I thought of this right away as soon as I became familiar with the technology. And I wished I had the time and the resources to go do it, because I would have liked to have been the very first person to pull this off, because I think this would
Right.
provide a tremendous repository of information, make this much more easily searchable. And I would even be able to prepare for shows like this far better, because the information would all be sorted and searchable in a way that it presently isn't. The answer to your question is yes. I don't know who it is, but I do still occasionally watch America's Untold Stories. And one of their most recent episodes, they just discussed that indeed this is already underway. They already know the person that's doing this. This work has begun. So there also is an organization called the Mary Farrell Foundation that people can look up, which is a complete online repository. If something is accessible in a document, they have it. And they have built the largest library on this subject. So the National Archives is a source, but not everything is available online. And the National Archives has physical evidence also that you can check in. You can go in, it's like a library, and you can go into a room and you can, under supervision, be able to look or even touch some of the evidence that's there. But in terms of documentation, which, okay, since we're on the subject, let me talk about researchers versus writers.
Yes.
I believe that there are people who are very, very good, like James Douglas, at communicating. They know how to explain, express in a powerful, organized, convincing way information. The people who have done the greatest work in this thing are researchers. And I am resistant in any way, shape, or form, even the amount of time that I've given being called a researcher. Researchers go into original documents and original evidence. And I've done a tiny bit of this, but they do this. This is what they do. They dig in deep on something. So there's a guy out there named Vince Palomara. Vince Palomara knows everything about the Secret Service at that time. Everything. And he talked to a lot of the people in the Kennedy detail throughout the 1990s when he was a young man. So when Vince starts to veer a little bit outside of his area, he's a little shakier, like I am, right? He doesn't actually get all of his facts completely right. He's got a lot of opinions, but he's a little fuzzier on a couple things. But when it comes to Secret Service, he's got that stuff nailed down. And he's put up a vast repository of information on YouTube, of all places. Some of it is incredibly boring. So when you're looking at research, a lot of times you're looking at a mimeographed, photocopied copy of a copy of a copy of a copy.
That real grainy typewritten stuff.
You can barely read it. And they will go through and they will study these types of materials, just as an example. And they will pore over everything, not knowing what the connection is to stuff, or they'll go in looking for something specific, and they will turn over new evidence to the public. So I will share, if we, in a future episode, one guy in particular who I think has done an incredible job of assembling some of this kind of information, who has done, a over-the-top fantastic job of actually putting it into a book, for example. But I wouldn't recommend anybody read this book. It's hard. And there's a couple of these guys. Their material is so dense, so kind of disconnected. They're interested in the research. So a researcher is somebody who can deal with the ponderous boredom and the long tedium in between finding information, who will enjoy the experience of discovery or of connecting a dot so much that they can endure that. And they'll get all excited about a piece of evidence that they have. But their ability to string a story together is very, very bad. I don't have that. I actually think I'm more the type of person who can take something and then begin to convey it to people. And that's why I admire what Douglas has done so much. I look at that book and go, okay, that nobody needs to do this now because he did it. Now, I don't agree with everything that he's said. I want to be clear there too. He is a little bit more in the motive camp. JFK and the Unspeakable has to do with what drove this thing. And I question some of the things that he and Oliver Stone believe about that. But that doesn't matter. It's still excellently communicated. Oliver Stone, Rob Reiner, these guys have done a great job of communicating the story, and they know how to tell it. Rob Reiner's not a researcher. He's reading researchers' works and then figuring out how to popularize it.
Makes sense. And if you're watching this and you want the research, you know where to go. If you want the entertainment, sort of coming up to speed in a hurry, you know where to go. What is it, behind all of this? What really sets you off to want to dive into this whole thing, Jim?
Because I don't know whether my view of the state was thorough enough, which is saying something, because I co-created the Zero Aggression Project.
Right.
And we already, and my work professionally now, even now, has a philosophical component to it. We talked in previous episodes about the philosophy of human respect, and I'm actually involved in helping a gentleman spread this idea that I think is incredibly powerful, that gives it kind of a foundation that we can all agree on.
I'd say it's like an uber motive.
Yes. So I think he gave it more of a foundation, libertarianism itself, more of a foundation than anybody else has. And so I've been trying to get at all this. And, we come and we do a podcast here like Gracearchy, and I've described that my views on faith, my spiritual views, my theological views dovetail so much that they're warp and woof with my social views, my libertarian views. Like, I will go so far as to say that God is a libertarian. Now, I don't mean that in the modern political sense. I mean that in the sense that God seems to have a special honor that exceeds all these claims of omnipotence for free will. And there's something extraordinary about that. And I think it's underexplored. And I find dissatisfaction with both left and right-wing institutional churches, because it's one of the things I believe they are completely missing. And I have a sense of why that's happened too, that I won't go into. So today, because it's off topic, but I come at this and say, did I have a complete enough view of just how diabolical the state is? And
so this is one of those aha moments. That's more than just, the state is wrong. It goes, the state is maybe evil.
Well, because it turns out, by the way, that, when it comes, let's say, to the FBI participated in several years later in the assassination of an American citizen by the Chicago police. That's historical fact. So they also did terrible things to Martin Luther King. And that was a story that we only know about because a couple of people, professors, broke into a government building in the early 1970s and discovered COINTELPRO. And then stuff starts to come out. So there's the FBI misbehaving. The CIA has toppled governments and participated in assassinations around the globe. And at the time of the Kennedy, this is one of the reasons I can't be in the cult of Kennedy, which is what happens to most of the people who research this. They end up in the cult of Kennedy somehow. Or maybe they were already predisposed to be in the cult of Kennedy.
I went right there. I'm reading the books, man. All of a sudden I was a Kennedy.
Yeah. So I've observed this and I can't do that. They were using this tool. John and his brother Robert believed in regime change and the tools of it. Like they were using it. They're wanting to assassinate Fidel Castro in Cuba. So,
which, by the way, do you remember the name of that book? Because it's an amazing biography of the brothers.
No.
I'll try to find it, put it in the show notes.
Okay.
Compelling book.
So, if you understand that you understand that Jack's actually very sophisticated and very complicated, and his method of going about things, he's got an external motive and an internal motive. He's got something he says to one audience and something he says to another. There's a lot of attempt to try to make him like a hero in this story.
We're talking about the Dulles brothers, right?
Well, the Dulles brothers are the ones that let's go back. Okay. I was talking about John Kennedy, but the Dulles brothers are definitely very, very important. So John Foster Dulles is in the cabinet, and I believe he's Secretary of Defense. Please don't quote me on that. I'm having a senior moment as I'm sitting here with you. But I believe that was his position in Eisenhower's administration. And his brother, Alan, is the head of the CIA.
Yeah, they started the CIA, basically.
And both of these guys come from a law firm in D.C. that basically helped create and build the CIA. The CIA is a blue blood creature made up of a variety of people. And when I say blue blood, I mean they're like Ivy League. Like these are the elite who have designed a way to basically monitor their interests through the state. This is a regulatory capture writ large they have come up with a way that they're going to advance their own interests inside the government. That is the purpose of the CIA. That's its creation. That's its genesis. And Allen Dulles is the director of the CIA at the time that Kennedy comes to office. He's the director of the CIA when the Bay of Pigs happens, and he ends up getting fired by John F. Kennedy. And then somehow or other, magically, he ends up on the Warren Commission after the president's been assassinated. You know, this to me reeks of conflict of interest, because he is somebody who may well have had a grudge against Kennedy, certainly wasn't a Kennedy supporter, who ends up on this commission. And no member of the commission attends more than 70% of the meetings, including the Chief Justice for whom the commission was named, Earl Warren. They all had other obligations at the time and could not make it to every one of the meetings of the commission. Dulles was in attendance more than anybody. He asked more questions than anybody. In fact, he asked more questions than nearly all members combined during the course of these things. There is a way in which I feel the fox was guarding the henhouse. And there was a belief on Dwight Eisenhower's part that he had sent people to Normandy. He had watched what happened at D-Day. He had seen the destruction of war, being the general in World War II and being in charge of the European theater. And here was almost a bloodless way to impose U.S. policy throughout the world against bad actors. They could just use these tools that were now, for the first time in history, we had a standing intelligence agency. We always had them in war, but they always would disperse. This one stayed together and became the CIA. Here was a way that we could overthrow governments. And the story that I'm most familiar with is the one in Iran, which is they overthrew the government of an elected president by the name of Mossadegh. This is history that every Iranian knows. They know the day it happened. They know how it happened. But Americans didn't know this history. In 1977, when that same embassy from which the CIA operated in their coup, under the direction of Kermit Roosevelt, descendant of Teddy Roosevelt, had basically organized and managed a coup in Tehran. And they didn't know it. This story started to come out in 1998 and wasn't admitted to by our own government until 2013. But it has impacts on policies. The reason the government that is there now is there has everything to do with the actions that the government took on at that time that were so bloodless and clean in Eisenhower's view, but have had blowback since and created havoc and difficulty. Our border crossings, the people coming out of Guatemala was one of those target governments at the time. We're still feeling the effects of the decisions made that were driven by the Dulles brothers.
Sure. Arms for hostages.
Then there's a string coming out of the JFK thing. There's a lot of actors that overlap that are in each of these stories. And the three crown jewel stories in which you can draw a direct thread, you can even see the same names involved in it, are the JFK assassination, Watergate, and Iran-Contra. All three of these things have common actors or descendants of those actors. When I say descendants, I mean these were people who were directly mentored by some of the people that were involved in the previous story. They had personal relationship with them and served in some of the same offices and capacities.
One of the things that I've heard recently about the Watergate tapes, remember old Nixon, is that he had the White House Oval Office recorded because he was concerned that something from the JFK era would blow back on him.
So the story on this is that in 1959, 60, I'm not sure exactly, it becomes obvious to Nixon he's going to be the Republican nominee. And he had a close relationship with Howard Hughes, the billionaire, the guy that made the Spruce Goose.
Yep.
And he reaches out to him and says, look, I'm going to be elected in November. I'm going to win the race. I want to act quick. I want to move very fast. I want to take out Castro. I want you to begin to form a
task force
that will get the job done. And it needs to be detached from me. So the role that he had at that juncture was the president, Eisenhower, had given Vice President Nixon a role leading a committee, the name of which escapes me at the moment, that basically was making decisions like this. What kind of secret ops will the president, are we recommending the president pursue or not pursue? And they're the ones kind of asking the tough questions in the president's absence on the president's behalf before ideas were brought to him. Does that make sense?
It does.
And so Nixon is head of this. And so this could happen during Eisenhower, but he really wants to make sure he's ready to hit the ground running as president. And so they begin forming what will be this thing. And I'll skip the steps of that story. This is all historically validated. What I'm saying here is also not historically debatable anymore. Everybody knows that this happened. The mob is invited into this. Literally, the American mafia is invited into a participation in a plot to kill Castro. And assassination plans are put into motion. But then Nixon loses. And Kennedy becomes president. And there's a concern on Nixon's part after the events spiral out of control that end up resulting in the murder of the president, that in some way that event is going to get tied back onto him. And that may well, we cannot say with conclusively, but there's a significant circumstantial evidence that the actions and activities that took place involving Watergate were somewhat an attempt to make sure that the Howard Hughes portion of that story wasn't sitting in some Democratic file. It wasn't about to be released.
This is not just paranoid Nixon. This seems to be a concern that was typical of second-level government employees at that time in the CIA and the FBI, in the executive, where there were just things that we didn't talk about, but everybody knew were going on.
Okay, so let me just say, where you sent my mind when you say that is to talk about the presidents themselves. So Harry Truman, who is no longer in office, but was there at the creation of the CIA. He's the president when the CIA is created. He comes to believe that they have created a monster that is out of control. And he doesn't know what to do about it, but he makes an arrangement with the Washington Post. And it only appears in the morning edition of that paper. I think it's the Washington Post. Please, again, if I'm fact check me in the comments, but I believe it's the Post. For an editorial to be published. Now, the assassination happens on November 22, 1963. And he insists that the only time that he will agree to release this, the date that he will, in return for using his name and being able to publish that, former President Harry Truman has this op-ed, and I'm going to give this exclusive to you, that it only be published on exactly December 22nd, 1963.
You mean November?
Nope.
December.
Literally 1 month to the day.
A month to the day. Okay.
An anniversary day of 1 month later, saying that the CIA probably needed to be closed. So why does he write a column that has to be 1 month to the day, November 22nd to December 22nd? Why does he do that and call for the closing of the CIA? Well, it turned out that he believed that there was some involvement there. Lyndon Johnson, who succeeds John F. Kennedy after he's out of office, late in his life does an interview where he concedes that he suspects there might have been government involvement coming out of the CIA. Robert F. Kennedy is at home having meetings at his house on that Friday, and he gets news of what happened, sends everybody else home. He calls their friend, who's the newer, the guy that took Dulles' place, CIA director, over to the house and asks him, and this is such a strange wording to me, is this one of our people? Is this one of us? So he had suspicions that either the mob or the CIA were responsible for what happened. Never publicly expressed those things. Didn't believe that it was good for the country to know at the time, but privately had expressed to more than one person. Starting that very day, he wanted to know if the CIA involved. He called the director over to his house, and they walked around. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has told this story, but it's also backed up by Arthur Schlesinger's accounts of the time. This is a historically attested statement. So the people of the time believed it. Richard Nixon believed it. And Gerald Ford, we have a little more suspicion there because he was a member himself of the Warren Commission.
The Warren, yeah.
Okay, so we don't know Publicly, he said things very consistent. However, there is a story where he talked to, I believe it was a French ambassador, might have even been de Gaulle himself. I don't remember the exact details of the story, but he basically says, we know that it was members of the government. Okay, so we have all these guys that were kind of contemporaneously involved in the state or had just recently been involved in the state at the time. And these are not whack jobs. These are not conspiracy nutcases. These are people who understand how the factory works. And they're making this conjecture that this is very, very much possible. And today, to bring everything back full circle to Donald Trump's recent executive order, the majority of the documents that are still under redaction or hidden from us that are in the collection, and because there's a discussion about what's in and not in the collection, but what's in the collection, the majority of the stuff that's still secret is CIA material. Now, there are several other government agencies involved there. And I just said the majority, meaning more than half. It's actually significantly more than half of the documents we still don't have access to or complete access to are the CIA's documents.
Are we in fact, we meaning America, are we in fact all unindicted co-conspirators on this assassination or these assassinations by virtue of the fact that, we employed the people who did them?
No, this gives me a chance to kind of set a little bit of history for why we're at this point right now. First, it is taken for granted that everybody has seen the Zapruder film, but in 1960s and coming into the 1970s, that was not true. It was not a publicly available thing.
Yeah.
So the assassination takes place in 1963, and in March of 1975, a young, very young Geraldo Rivera, who's one of the co-hosts of Good Morning America, would get to do a show that was not on every night called Good Night America. So it's after your late local news. And he became aware that there was Dick Gregory, the comedian, had seen and had access to the Zapruder film, which had been under lock and key. It was controlled by Time Life. And they had only allowed stills of it to be published in their magazines, but they had not allowed the actual film to be watched by the public. It was kept under wraps. And but there was an original copy floating around out there. And it's a strange term to say original copy, but there's technical definitions to all of this stuff that had been secured by a man by the name of Robert Groden, whom I've met and talked to. And I have some of his books. And Robert Groden, in fact, he has a huge photographic collection that he has assembled into these books that he has. Amazing photographic collection of the events of the time and stuff. He's gotten autopsy photos that we shouldn't have gotten either. He's just really, it's very impressive. So he brings the Zapruder film to Dick Gregory. Dick Gregory then starts talking it up. And Geraldo says, wait a minute, that's television. And ABC takes a huge, extraordinary risk because Time Life could have sued them and on a copyright claim. They owned that film, but he plays it for the American public for the first time. Now, this is back before VCRs. This is back before DVRs. This is, but it the next morning, everybody's like talking about it around the water cooler. And some people are regretting the fact that they got to bed too early that night and they didn't see it because all of their friends that did see it are abuzz.
Yeah.
And so there was two other provoking events. There was Watergate, and then there was the Church Commission. But this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, the playing of this film that led to the creation of the House Assassinations Committee.
Right, 79, something like that.
Yeah, Louis Stokes from Ohio ends up being it's also sometimes called the Stokes Committee. They basically do an investigation of the JFK and Martin Luther King assassinations, both to see if they are conspiracies. They do actually tentatively conclude in both cases that there is evidence to suggest a conspiracy. So this is one of those moments where you go, wait a minute, the official government position is no longer the Warren Commission, right?
Yep.
It's always called, and I'd even call it that. It's always called the official position, but it's not really anymore. They, based on sound evidence, send a referral over to the Attorney General's office to do further sound investigations based off a dictabelt, I think it was called, recording that indicated that different shots from different places, and they conclude that there may well have been a second shooter. They don't say there is; they say there may have been. That's one of their conclusions. Which would, all you got to have is one other person involved, and all of a sudden you have a conspiracy. So the standard that the other side has to meet, the people that are parroting the Warren Commission, is that there is only one lone nut in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository firing at the president with a Mannlicher-Carcano, 3 shots, 2 of which hit occupants of the vehicle, one of which was so magic that it defied physics and went through 2 of them.
Yes.
That you have to maintain, and his name was Lee Harvey Oswald. You have to maintain all of those things. That story is incredibly fragile and really easy at several junctures to break. And, but the House committee begins doing that. And then Oliver Stone's movie comes out in, I think it's again 1990 or 91. I'm iffy on the dating of that. And that sends a wave through the American people. So compelling and so strong that they create the Assassination Records Review Board, the Congress does, and they say that all documents have to be released by 2017. As many as possible need to be released now. They lay out standards for getting that done. An immense amount between 1994 and 1998 of records actually are released, and others are scheduled. The board is defunded, so it doesn't stay operating, unfortunate to this story. It's part of the reason we're still here. But they get an amazing amount of information out, but they were created out of Oliver Stone's making of that movie. And the Congress was not only compelled to act, this is extraordinary. I don't want people missing this. They were not only compelled to act by Oliver Stone's film and the public response to it, they voted unanimously to release these records. There wasn't a single dissenting vote in House or Senate for this plan to release these records by 2017, which is extraordinary because one of the U.S. senators was none other than Joseph Biden of Delaware. He voted for this bill. And what he decided to do after Trump did not release the records as promised. So let's just go to that day. In 2017, yes. Donald Trump wakes up in the morning and he sends out a tweet, as he was wont to do at the time. And he says, I am going to be releasing the records today. The American public's going to find out the rest of the story. And Mike Pompeo, we all know this now, walked into the Oval Office and said, Mr. President, you can't do it today. Why not? Well, there's some things. There's been different people who've had different takes on what actually happened that day, but suffice it to say that by that night, it hadn't happened. And the president refused to release them. And there were more releases, but he did not follow the law. Okay, so we elect a new president, Joseph Biden. He knows what the law is, and he voted for the law. So clearly, he's going to do the right thing. Well, first they used the pandemic as an excuse to delay, and then they issue something called a Transparency Act. And transparency is meant in this sense, in the Orwellian version of it. As in, we are going to call this transparency precisely because it is going to make some things non-transparent. Some things will be transparent, and because we are revealing those things, the rest of it can now be completely transparent. And he basically writes his own law. He completely ignores what the law says, and he lays out transparency standards that are in direct violation of the act that created the Assassination Records Review Board. And that's why we sit here today. There was no data released last year at all, none. And there's only been sparse data since that time in 2022, I believe it was. That might have been 21. I'm fuzzy on the dates at the moment. But they basically took the order and reversed its full intent under the Biden administration. And that brings us to now. And there's this interesting thing. The president signs this order and gives 15 days for the release of this information, for a plan to be developed. Not for the release of this information, but for a plan to be developed. And the chief person responsible for initiating this plan is the acting director of national intelligence. She's actually the COO of the department. Her name is Laura Shiao. She was involved in the Biden administration in writing this transparency plan that was designed not to release this information. And this funny situation exists because the director of national intelligence that Donald Trump wants to appoint Tulsi Gabbard has, as we sit here recording the show, not yet been confirmed. And there's only 15 days for them to put together a plan. There's been a lot of criticism of this need, and I have my concerns, but the way government works, you have a fit and to get started type of step. You have to figure out a plan's going to say, we're going to have these people working on it. They're going to spend this much time on it. We're going to spend this much money to get it done. They're going to release it in the following ways. That's what a plan would do. And it's completely warranted to start there, right? And say, sure, what's your plan and your budget? I believe the 15 days will come and go, and this order will not be complied with because they don't have the right person in charge of it. There's questions as to whether or not she can be the person to do it because she's only the acting director at the moment. So I'm a little iffy as to whether or not it's even a good thing that he issued the order at this time. I know why he did it. It's because there's this political posturing thing you do where you say, on my first day in office, on my first week in office, I'm going to X. But we probably should have said, once we have a director of national intelligence that we appointed, we will commission her. Would have actually been the more studious, nerdy, but yet accurate way of handling all this. I have more confidence that Tulsi Gabbard will do the right thing than I do that Ms. Shao will do the right thing.
So how much of what's still in the bag will actually be helpful at this point, given that we get a whole bunch of it that's redacted anyway?
Even on the most generous analysis of what the government's role was on the events of November 22nd, 1963, let's say
meaning that maybe the CIA really wasn't involved as much as we kind of think they were.
Yeah, there is another historical fact that the public doesn't really understand or know, and that was that both the FBI and the CIA had been monitoring Lee Harvey Oswald for years. He had been a Russian defector. He'd been in the Marine Corps at a base that handled sensitive intelligence information. He appears to have had intelligence connections right there in his role working for the U.S. Marine Corps in Japan. And he flees and right away offers the Soviets intelligence information. He says he has intelligence information to share. He goes into Russia, and then he comes back out and he comes home with a Russian wife. And under the most generous understanding of this, our government may have been concerned about what he had told, but even more so now that he brought back literally through marriage, he brought into the United States a Russian spy. And she seems to be the target in some ways. George de Mohrenschildt is part of what's called the White Russian or the Russian American community. They're very anti the Soviets. There's a significant number of them in Dallas. It's a very organized, well-established community in Dallas, very connected, very successful in business. These were people who had really come to this country and flourished in it, who, their earlier generations, de Mohrenschildt's family had their property stolen by the Soviets. So they had a bone to pick with communism in general, but specifically the version that came out of the Soviet Union. And they immediately take this Russian-speaking American and his very Russian wife, who maybe is able to tell them things that's going on in their homeland. Like she's recent. She's just
sure. It's community.
What's the story back home? What are people going through and so forth? What's happening? Do you know so-and-so? Like there's a lot of that kind of thing that goes on. And
as one would do, right? If you showed up in an expat community in some foreign country, you'd want to check in.
And George de Mohrenschildt basically shuttles them around and introduces them to a lot of people, brings them to the right parties and so forth when he comes back. But the CIA has a special file. We now know they had a special file that was being routed to the counterintelligence office for him. And they were continuing to monitor him until roughly a month before the assassination. They ended their monitoring at about that time. The FBI didn't trust the CIA. This is one of the funniest things about history that people don't understand, is that a lot of these government agencies didn't trust each other. And they had turf wars and jurisdiction issues and just flat out believe that, the guys in that group are, a bunch of either, a-holes or criminals, right? We're the good guys. And this rivalry existed between the FBI and the CIA. And the FBI was monitoring because they didn't trust the CIA or what the president was collecting. And on top of that, J. Edgar Hoover was a blackmail artist. He liked to blackmail politicians. So he wanted information wherever he could find it. He was constantly gathering data and keeping files on people. So he too was trying to figure out what was going on with Oswald. And the FBI was monitoring him until, again, roughly, I don't know, a month or two before the assassination. And so both of these agencies have, they can't tell the American public with a straight face that they got completely caught off guard by a guy in a building along the route of a presidential motorcade. We just had no idea that this guy was there. And under the most generous view of this, they would have an incentive motive to cover up their involvement or their role, their understanding of the events that happened that day. They needed to lie to the American public because they believed they needed to do so to protect their institutions.
Plausible deniability, right?
That's the most generous argument or motive that you can apply to the behavior of these entities. Now, I actually believe some more things exist that point towards more nefarious or bad circumstantial evidence against the CIA in particular, but that's the most generous motive. They were very much aware. So now, fast forward into the present, there's things that they've kept under wraps all this whole time. And one of the things that's just extraordinary about this is if it is a lone nut in a window on the 6th floor his motivations are all internal and personal, what needs to be secret about that?
Exactly. Which is why the Warren Commission took that point of view.
Well, the Warren Commission is very motivated from the very beginning for a specific thing, and that is to avoid World War III. The Chief Justice himself did not want a nuclear war with the Soviets. He was a liberal Republican, very liberal, and he was a peace guy. He did not want a nuclear war to happen. Lyndon Johnson leans on him. Every effort is made to take this case out of Texas, out of Dallas, which is Johnson's home turf, at a point. Every effort is taken to take it out of there and try to create a story. And there's evidence that begins that weekend. In fact, the day after the assassination, it appears there's already work being done, both in the Johnson administration, the brand new administration, and in the FBI, and in direct conversation between the leaders of said groups, that is Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover, to begin focusing this story, refocusing it on one man. Because if this is the Cuban government attempting to get back at the president, or this is the Soviet Union trying to avenge in some way, if this is somebody like that, this could lead to a nuclear war. And Lyndon Johnson does not want that kind of war. He's willing to give them Vietnam because that one's going to occur way far away. But he doesn't want a war that comes home.
And in context, we've all seen the crazy movie, but in context, there are actually high-ranking Pentagon officials who want a nuclear war. This is part of the what he's pushing back against.
Yeah, the Douglas book in particular does a very good job of illustrating this. Again, this is historically, we know this from declassified information.
Yeah, this is not news.
There was a memo given to the president where they literally suggested false flag provocations that would start a war with Cuba. They were very upset with his handling of the Bay of Pigs. They were very upset at a number of different things that he had done policy-wise involving Cuba. But they really did believe that we had, despite what the American public knew or understood at the time, they really did believe that understand that they had an outsized nuclear advantage over the Soviet Union, and that that every day that passed, the opportunity to win a war against the Soviet Union, given that these weapons existed, actually went down. It would be much, 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 much more dangerous with each passing week and month to engage the Soviets. The time to actually attack and destroy them was now, because this is when we would take the least damage in response. Now, even they were probably looking at 30 million Americans. Please understand, this was going to be a staggeringly bad event if they did it, but they felt that this was historically necessary because eventually it would become too late to win such a war. And this is part of what animates people who are very much in the hagiographic view of Kennedy. Like they're like, oh, okay, he was definitely for peace and he wanted to find other means to do this. And these guys were, they have no motive They're just ugly war monsters. But they actually believed they were saving lives in the long run. That was their motive, and that time was a wasting, and it had to be done. So, and that gets to why I think that this event may have happened in the first place. The thing that sets the wheels in motion, in my humble opinion, is that there is an attempt to create a false flag here that will draw us into war with Cuba and, by extension, the Soviet Union, because Cuba can't stand alone. We clearly could have defeated them.
Oh, we just had the missiles of October, right? That whole thing had just gone down.
Yeah, so then you have the Cuban Missile Crisis as well, and the Joint Chiefs and other people in the government didn't like how Kennedy's handled that. There's another little known fact. The Cuban Americans operating out of Florida at that time, the wound was very fresh. Castro had just taken over New Year's Day of 1959. This is early 1963 we're talking about now. So not even 5 years have gone by, okay? This is as recent to them as sitting here now for us. Yeah. Two weeks to flatten the curve, right? Kennedy had stopped their efforts to try to do regime change down there. So in the Bay of Pigs, you have a lot of volunteers. These are Cubans patriotically volunteering to participate in a military invasion. And then when that didn't happen, and you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that didn't lead to the war that they felt was necessary, they started increasingly becoming desperate, and they privately funded raids. They even sank a Russian ship at one point. They would take out basically power boats and go out and take heavy weapons and start shooting at things. Or they would sneak onto a part of the island and send people inland to go on missions inside the island. I mean, sabotage missions, assassination missions, God knows what. And all of this was kind of being privately funded. And Kennedy used the Coast Guard to interdict and stop them. And he also cut off funding to a prominent Cuban American organization that was involved in these activities. They had government funding, and he shut the spigot off. So the guy that was the president of it, resigns, and in their local newspapers that they were running down in Miami and their local community, they start hanging black crepe because they thought Cuba was lost. So these events are happening in March and April of 1963. And hope was being lost. I mean, they just lost farms and houses and property and status and had been forced to flee and come to America to reset up their lives. And they really, as patriotic Cubans, wanted to be able to go back home. And this is a fresh wound at the time, and they're taking it very, very hard.
Yeah, well, we don't see any of that in today's world. Things like this are resolved much more quickly, thinking of Gaza. Yeah.
So there's a couple things about this executive order that I'd like to hit before we wrap up. I'd like people to understand that, number one, it didn't release any records, and it doesn't guarantee that any records are going to be released soon. It's going to take a lot of time. Two, it's not worded exactly like I would have worded it to get the job done. And I'm not alone in thinking this. The people who have monitored this situation the closest, the people who have even sued, because there's a lawsuit against the Biden administration that was initiated to try to get these records released. They all feel that this could have been worded differently. One of the things that I don't like about it is it also includes the RFK and MLK. There's no organized body of these are the RFK records, these are the MLK records in quite the same way to the degree and precision that there are Kennedy records. There actually is something that is in the National Archive that's kind of the whole body of evidence at this point that is sitting under classification. It's available to be released. And something that you need to understand about the records themselves. So I should have brought in a sample of this, frankly, but you have a piece of paper and you can read the entire piece of paper and you can see the words on it. But now imagine that a marker has been taken through and things have been redacted. And what's been happening in many of the cases is that we have a document that starts off heavily redacted, and then in a future release, it is less redacted. And then yet in another release, it is a little less redacted until the point that the page becomes clear, and clarity on the page was supposed to happen by 2017. Most of the documents we're still awaiting fit this category. They have redactions on them. We want the redactions removed. But there are some documents that still remain that have not been released at all. We don't even know what they are. But there are other documents we do know are in there. We just never been able to see any portion of those documents, which is how I think most people think that there's a list of documents somewhere and nobody knows what's on them at all. That's a very small percentage of them that we don't know anything about those documents. More documents are in the state where we know that they're there and we can't see them, and still far, far, far more of them are documents we do have, but they've been redacted up to this point. And with the unveiling, with each unmasking, we learn something more or new about them. The order does not specify that these are the documents we're looking to get our hands on. It's an assumption on many people's part. It's probably the correct assumption. But there are documents that aren't in those files. And I want to give you a couple examples because a list was published by one of the experts on this. His name's Lawrence Schnapp. And there's another fantastic website, if you want to follow it, that is run by Jefferson Morley, formerly of the Washington Post, called JFK Facts. They're on Substack. You have to pay to get that information, though. Most of the sources I gave earlier, you don't have to pay to access. And they list some of the things. I'll come to the one that I think is the most dramatic at the end. They put it at the top of their list. But there are situations reports of the CIA's Miami investigation from that weekend of the assassination. And they were mentioned in a 1977 memo that Donald Heath to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The Heath memo is something we very much would like to have. We don't know that it itself is in the collection as of right now.
Right.
The Church Committee had files that the Department of Justice has argued in litigation are executive records and should be released to the president. There's a host of these kind of things listed. Another one of them, the Darnell film. The Darnell film is a very, very important thing. Darnell film may be depicting Lee Harvey Oswald standing in the entrance of the Texas School Book Depository, 6 floors down in the doorway at the time of the assassination. And the NBC has refused to turn that over to be studied. And that's the subject that was the subject of a lawsuit that had expired because the Assassination Records Review Board itself expired. But the files that I want to see the most out of this list that was provided by Lawrence Schnapp here is the George Joannides file. So George Joannides is an interesting character. Lee Harvey Oswald goes to New Orleans on the summer of 1963. And he participates in passing out leaflets and gets in a very public fight that ends up going into the courts. And then he does a radio interview that becomes famous after the assassination. Ed somebody or other, I can't remember his last name as I'm sitting here right now, does the interview. And he is working allegedly for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in passing out these leaflets. The fight that he has is with a Cuban-American student group. And we subsequently learned that Cuban-American student group and the primary person that he was fighting with were funded by the CIA to the tune of about $50,000 a year. Student group. Okay? You can, don't quote me on the exact figures. Feel free to provide corrections to anything I just said right now if I didn't say it all precisely. But who was their contact in the CIA? Who was managing that information? Put a pin in that, because in 1977 and 78, when they're doing the House committee, the Stokes Committee, to review this, the CIA sends a guy to they call a guy out of retirement. He had recently retired, and they said, hey, come back. We want you in your retirement. We're going to give you a special consultant job where because you had a top level clearance, you can help and you can facilitate this transmission and sharing of records from the CIA to the House committee. You'll know what to do and you'll know how to handle this situation. And the retired
is that
agent,
a nudge, nudge, wink, wink kind of thing? Or
the agent that they picked for this role was George Joannides.
Okay.
In the early 1990s, I believe it's the early 1990s, he dies. And we discover that he was the guy that was also the contact for this student group, this Cuban student group, that was funded, that had picked the fight with Lee Harvey Oswald.
Back in the 60s.
Back in the 60s, out on a public street, that led to a court case, that led to kind of this, okay. The gentleman who who was basically the lead chief counsel to the committee, subsequently went on to say that he felt incredibly duped, that this was not only professionally should have been revealed, This should have been disclosed. There's no way that that guy should have been in the position he should have been. He should have been one of the people they interviewed. But they did not have that information at the time. And he thought that threw the CIA's entire role in this investigation into question. That now he was of the belief that they had not cooperated and that even much of the work that they had done was of less value as a result. And that is extraordinary. There is a George Joannides file. There's almost certainly a file. We've not been allowed to see it. We don't know if it's in the JFK records. This is one of the things that could come out. We just don't know whether it fits in that category. We don't know for sure it's in the National Archive. We kind of doubt it is, actually. The people in this community kind of doubt it's there, but it should be revealed. And the way the president's executive order was written, it's so broad that maybe now that's included or maybe it's not. We can't tell. And then I have my own suspicions here, and that is that Donald Trump is much more about the appearance than he is about the result. And I do suspect he's sincere in doing this executive order, and I do suspect it will lead to basically the release of just about everything that's still remaining, which is, by the way, a very small percentage of the original collection, the original limited collection. We'll get virtually everything. But the problem is that those things that we don't get, he's still going to claim he delivered it. I'm done. I've delivered it all. The files are opened. And that'll be the end of it because it's show more than it is tell. Now, I hope I'm wrong. I would love to be proven wrong, but his past character seems to indicate that that's what he's going to do here. He won't go the full distance that's required on this thing. He's not going to. He doesn't seem to have an attention span. I don't think he's going to go the full distance on this. And I think other actors around him might be satisfied somewhere shy of that too. I'm not. I want everything. I want everything out there. I don't want there to be anything. There's no point to hold this back. So I think that some of the things that we're going to learn have to do with the fact that there will be even more conclusive evidence of the role of the FBI, the CIA, and other government agencies as to what they knew about Oswald. They've been trying to keep much of that secret, and some of that stuff will come out. There will be more. Maybe some of the material that I just described might potentially be left out. And listen, if the Darnell film was released and it showed what many people suspect it shows, it takes Lee Harvey Oswald out of the position and automatically gets him to the point of, I don't want to say innocence, but at least not guilty of pulling the trigger.
Right.
Okay. So, and there's reason to believe that. There's actually a substantial story called Prayer Man that you can look into that gets into this in pretty deep detail. And the investigative work that's gone on there is beyond extraordinary. It's compelling stuff. And so that would be great if that would, I think, be the equivalent of a smoking gun. If that film exists, if we can get our hands on it, if it shows what they say it shows, that could be a smoking gun. I'm interested in one other person that we're not going to get into today, but I really want to know about her. So there is a common statement. Tucker Carlson has said this out loud. There's been other people said this out loud. They go, well, that happened 61 years ago. Everybody that's involved in it is dead. One of the things that has been protected in this act is the lives of the people who still are alive. Like their privacy concerns are one of the things that's been protected.
Sure, reasonably.
And they say, well, everybody's dead, but that's just not true. There's actually several people still alive. I'll give you three. And the third one is the one I'm most focused on. Marina Oswald is still alive. Lee Harvey Oswald's wife is still alive. She doesn't talk to the media since the 1990s. She questioned her original beliefs about what had happened with this story, which largely she believed because she had been told it. She now went on to say, I also think she didn't want to get kicked out of this country and had a motive to cooperate. But by the 1990s, she's an American citizen. Her daughters are grown, and she begins to recant some of her previous statements and say, listen, this is what I really believe. And she's treated incredibly shabbily by the media. I mean, she is really, really attacked for speaking up and saying the new things she said. So she went back into basically recluse hiding. She is still alive. She could still say things, frankly. I have listened to what was until about a year ago, her last interview. It was on tape. Jefferson Morley found it. It had never been released. It's interesting to put it nicely. She's still around. Buell Wesley Frazier, who drove Lee Harvey Oswald to work that day and worked inside the Texas School Book Depository as a co-worker of him. And what's interesting about Buell is that his story has evolved as well about what happened that day. And we could do a whole episode on Buell. We really could. I mean, there's some extraordinary stuff there. And then lastly, and the one I'm most interested in, is a woman by the name of Ruth Payne. So Marina Oswald is living at the Payne residence with Ruth is separated temporarily with her husband, Michael, and she will get back together with Michael within a month after. Their separation will end within a month after the assassination. But in the meantime, she has managed to move the Oswalds into her home. Now, Lee has a job at the Texas School Book Depository and lives in a rooming house over in Oak Cliff. I've been in Lee's room. It's as wide as my arms. And I'm only 5'6". So if you take your arms and you touch both sides of the wall, that's how wide the room is. It's basically
it's a closet.
Yeah, it's a window seat is what it is, but it's a glorified window seat. It's got a big space around it. And they put a sliding door in front on one side of it, and bam, you got a room. And that's his room that he lives at during the week when he's going to work every day. But on the weekends, he comes home to the Payne house. And he did so every weekend except the last weekend of his life. He ends up getting arrested. But he wasn't planning on coming because he had actually come the night before. So Ruth's story is fascinating. There are somewhere between 30 and 40 different points of interest in this story that if you looked at all of them collectively, you almost have to conclude that she's a government agent, that she's somehow or other connected.
Seriously.
Oh, it's extraordinary. And there's other people who've done some stuff on this too. There's a guy that actually interviewed her just a few years ago and did a documentary. His name's Max Good. But she's very cautious about who she talks to. She puts a litmus test out in front of people. And if you don't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was involved in the General Walker shooting, she won't talk to you. If you don't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald shot the president, she won't talk to you. She asks litmus test questions before the conversation and then shuts down any further conversation. And she's still alive. So information about her connections, her role, the government actually has legal motivation still intact, in my humble opinion, to not share that information with us. She still does interviews and talks. She went to the Texas School Book Depository, the sixth floor museum, and spoke there a couple of years ago. She did an event in 2 years ago on the 60th anniversary in the city of Irving, which honors her. They have her house as part of their natural history museum. I've been in the house. And she came back, and when she comes into town, she visits the house and actually stays over for the night in this museum, and then went and spoke to a crowd of people at their Irving Citizen or Center, Community Center or Museum. She went to there and spoke. When I was in town in Dallas 2 years ago, I had a choice going there, which was a bit of a drive, or going to another event. I chose the other event, but I had a choice that night whether or not I wanted during that trip to go see her speak. But I think that she's got a big, big story to tell. And I would treasure, I think every one of us would, a deathbed confession on her part, or a late in life, because she's obviously very advanced in age, confession of what she actually did that day. I have specific thoughts about her role. But I am persuaded that she knows more about this story and understands that it is a conspiracy. That doesn't mean, and I want to be very clear, I don't believe that she actually was involved in the assassination. I don't even think she had a complete awareness until after it happened of what exactly she was doing. There's this concept called compartmentalization, where people have different roles and they don't have the full picture of what it is that they're involved in. And I believe that she could have even been a victim, potentially, of compartmentalization initially. That Lee Harvey Oswald may have been a victim of compartmentalization. He more than likely went through a process called sheep dipping, where he was used and made to look to be the guilty scapegoat in this particular instance on purpose for other people's bigger policy ends, including the policy ends of none other than the President of the United States. There are a lot of people who believe Lyndon Johnson is involved. I have not seen enough evidence to believe this. The Men Who Killed Kennedy, a famous documentary series, presented some evidence. I believe that evidence is very fallen, fallible, not great evidence. And I know that Roger Stone has written a book about this and very much believes it. I would be predisposed to believe it because my father suspected it. Lyndon Johnson was one of the most brilliant politicians of all time, and also a criminal. There's something called the Lyndon landslide, where you deliver votes at the last minute to in terms of like faked elections or rigged elections. This guy was one of the people that knew how to run such a thing. There's even evidence he got a friend off for murder in court. So there's significant things that this guy was capable of doing, extraordinary things politically. I mean, Robert Caro's biography of him extends over several volumes. And you read that thing and you're like, wow, this is an amazing character. And I don't mean that all in the positive sense. There's a lot of things about him that are very, very negative. There's no way he would survive in the Me Too generation. Let's put it that way. So I don't think he was involved, but I definitely think he had a motivation to lead the cover-up.
This is kind of an off-the-wall question, but might be a good place to land the plane. And I absolutely realize whom I'm asking this question to.
Oh boy!
Right, but Jim, tell us about your trust in the state at this particular moment in history right now.
Well, I already believed that it was immoral, unjust, and flat out didn't work to give anybody the ability to determine that they had the power to initiate theft or violence or any other form of coercion to achieve their social or political goals. I just don't believe that. Now, there are a lot of people who sign a pledge that says something relatively similar to that when they joined the Libertarian Party, which I did in 1996. That was my conversion point. Shortly thereafter, I joined it. It was Harry Brown, the Libertarian nominee, who I 4 years later worked for. I was on his staff. I helped his second campaign as press secretary. And I've been full-time involved in some libertarian or libertarian adjacent activity ever since. That was 1999 that I started there. So I already had that view, but I would have been what you called a limited government libertarian, that I believed that we needed to get back to the Constitution, as it were. In somewhere in the neighborhood of 2011 ballpark, we were beginning to plot and plan the creation of two entities, one of which didn't get off the ground at all. The other did. One was called Deny Consent. The other was called the Zero Aggression Project, which sponsors this show, zeroaggressionproject.org. We launched that for the very first time and then gave it a full launching a few years later. But we began sharing this idea with the world all the way back in 2012. And as we were conceiving how we would release it, it ended up coming out in, I think, 2014. Maybe 2015. I don't remember now. But as we were beginning to conceive of this idea and share it with people, it was the idea that the level of aggression that anybody should consider legal or moral, let alone practical, should be zero. We should be striving to get to zero. So I already was somebody that believed that the state shouldn't do virtually everything that it does. That view has only continued to expand and deepen over time. But now I look at this event and I look at, kind of several historical events that I think are related. And I suspect that the entire state is a giant grift. It is a method by which one group of people gets to live at the expense of another group of people. And the people who manage and leverage this to the greatest degree are some of the wealthiest amongst us. We just did an episode about Mr. Galloway and his more socialist views. I want to sympathize when he starts saying that oligarchs are to blame. My problem is that he just casts everybody who makes more than $10 million a year as an automatic oligarch. And I can't go there. I can't go into the politics of envy on this. That's not how this works. Somebody who makes their money honestly by satisfying enough people in order to achieve that has earned that. And that's something that should, I believe, be honored. But are there oligarchs? Whew. Yes, there are. And the CIA is an internal government agency designed to manage the interests of the most oligarchy people amongst us that walk amongst us. And that's been true all along. It was very, very true in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. It might be a little less true now, but back then it was just completely washed in oligarchy. And there has been a change in how our state runs since World War II. World War II is looked back at as the Great War. It's the war that, was so justified and just. But one of the ways that we lost World War II was the creation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the modern military-industrial complex. And we were warned by Eisenhower on his way out the door that we needed to watch out for that. And some people who've observed this story, I don't know if I count myself as one of them, believe that that's one of the lessons that comes out of this story. But I come away thinking that the state is enamored with war. The state, it doesn't just simply carry out the action of managing the war. It's not a reluctant participant in these things. It seeks wars to start, and war is its ethos, down to the point that we have wars on illiteracy and wars on poverty and wars on this and that. We're always fighting. We're fighting with each other and then fighting over who's going to get the power, and then taking the power and directing it in forceful ways at other people. And I just think that's demonic. And so this just kind of like puts the cherry on top of the whole thing for me, is that there's a strong potential that actors of the state could have done something this bad and got away with it. And before you write me off as completely crazy, and some of you still will after I give you this example, the outgoing president on his way out the door gave a pardon to a man who'd been charged officially with nothing by the name of Anthony Fauci. He covered up the leak of a gain-of-function material in a lab. He covered up what he knew. He hid. He organized a conspiracy to cover up information.
Sure. We've done a whole episode on this, a spillover gang.
We did it, by the way, when we did that spillover gang, far less was known at the time than we now know. I actually got an important hit. One of the things I thought happened, I now doubt. Okay. One of the things I said in that episode, I now doubt. We've learned so much more about this. The evidence is overwhelming that this is what happened. And just now, with the new president, the CIA, their take has been released that this came out of a lab. We already knew that the Department of Energy thought that. We already have a former member of the national health bureaucracy at the top level who's now said this, and that this is what he believes. And the FBI, we knew that this is what they believed. We already knew that. But now you can add to the list the aforementioned CIA. Their records, their information, their study points to this. This was a lab leak, and he actively engaged in a conspiracy. He appears to have played a lead role in a conspiracy to hide this information from you.
This is Fauci we're talking about.
Yeah, 100%. And now he's got a pardon, which I think everything should be done to take full advantage of all the different legal loopholes we have now to get around that. For one thing, he can't complain. He can't claim the Fifth Amendment anymore.
Right. He can testify with immunity and we'll know what happened.
And he should be compelled to do so at every juncture we have. I now no longer put anything past them. And I deeply suspect that there's a grift at work. And when the grift begins to be exposed, they look, oh, here's a shiny object. Oh, a squirrel. They try to do something to distract you off of that subject. And then when that doesn't work, they start marginalizing the people who are raising the claims. You're conspiracy theorist. You know when the term conspiracy theorist really takes off in the American? Those two words hadn't been put together until 1964 to begin describing people who were questioning what was becoming the official government position in the Warren Commission. That's a 1960s term, baby. And it was designed to marginalize people. This is part of how a PSYOP works. So my view of the state, there is nothing. You cannot give me a thing that I don't believe could be done better than the way that they do it. And I believe that the moral price that we have to pay, the social damage that it does to our muscles of compassion, of honesty and integrity, of keeping our word, all the different ways in which it corrodes society. It's the cost of this thing significantly outweighs the benefits it allegedly confers. You spend that much money, some good may come out of it. Yeah, you could point to stories and say, well, that anecdote happened, or this collection of anecdotes happened. But at the end of the day, I believe it is demonstrable that better results would occur in every instance, in every single one, if we didn't take this immoral path of doing what we would never do in private space, which is I'm going to threaten you with a punch in the mouth, or I'm going to take your stuff, or I'm going to kill you if you don't give me what I want. You have to do things my way. No, I'm completely over that. And this story, and stories that I've learned adjacent to it, convinces me that they will go to criminal, even murderous lengths to get what they want.